The Supreme Court has ruled that the government's Rwanda migrant scheme is unlawful. It is not going to be able to go ahead under its current form. Well, joining me right now is Claire Pearsall. She's a former special advisor at the Home Office, and also still with me, Conservative commentator Benedict Spence. Let's go our cameras back to the studio rather than people milling around outside the Supreme Court, as interesting as that is, I'm sure, to people. Claire, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I think you're probably in a minority in this studio and among our audience. You're quite pleased with this decision.
Yes, I am.
Why?
Yeah, because it was a really ill thought through policy. It was never going to work, and it was not going to provide good value for money. And I think you could see that from the outset.
There are government policies that do any of those things?
Well, you'd kind of hope there should be, not that there is. But this one in particular was going to be very expensive, and it wasn't going to deal with the number of people that we currently have coming across the channel. That problem is still there. It wasn't going to stop that. And we seem to have sent more journalists and ministers to Rwanda than anything else so far.
Indeed. I have to say, I mean, Benedict Spence, that you and I were discussing just beforehand, in terms of the likelihood of this policy actually providing a deterrence. This wasn't going to stop the boats. This policy was more about the PR. This policy was more about the principle that we get to decide who stays in this country.
Yes, well, I suppose it was more about the PR, the idea that we get to do that. But I think, Claire's right in that this was always very unlikely and actually very expensive. I would just like a government that wasn't focused on PR, that was actually focused on policies that actually work. And I thought this from the start, as much as it would have been a wonderful idea if this had worked, if this was some sort of real curveball that nobody had thought of. If you just outsource policies and you outsource the responsibilities for these things, they're going to come back to bite you. And that is what this government continues to do. It tries to sort of shunt problems into other people's directions and say, to appear to be taking it seriously. But it's not actually thought this through at all. It's not sort of grasped the nettle by the roots, and just sort of throughout it has been a PR exercise. And broadly speaking, nobody likes the idea of having to bring over lots and lots of people and pay for them to stay here whilst they're being processed. But ultimately, that's what other countries do. People often talk about the Australia policy, for example. Australia had to do the proper thing. OK, it was on a sort of an offshore island, but they paid for it properly. They went through it all themselves. That was an idea that was championed by the Conservative government at some point. What happened to that, rather than just sending it to a country that everybody knew had serious issues around human rights?
And this is one of the things. Do you think, Claire, that this would be a completely different ruling, or we perhaps wouldn't have gone into this mess if a different country had been chosen that would have a sort of stronger track record on human rights? I'm really struggling to think of what is the country that is a wonderful, fantastic place that people would love to be sent to, couldn't complain about any human rights grounds, but is also willing to take in hundreds or thousands of failed asylum seekers, or indeed proven asylum seekers from the UK, from various different, war-torn, God-forsaken basket case countries around the world. But that's the reality. Yeah. Who's going to want these people other than a country like Rwanda?
Well, and I think there's your problem. And when you're looking at what Europe are suggesting at the moment is very similar. So people are grabbing onto this and say, well, Europe are going to do this, why can't we? But what they're talking about is offshoring the decision-making process, and then those people come back. So I think that other countries may be more interested if they were only being used as a mere administrative function. I think you're quite right. Why would any other country want to take in hundreds of thousands of people that the UK have said no thank you? Why would any other country, unless it's for an awful lot of money, why would they take them on?
We are paying the Rwandan government an awful lot of money. Look, in terms of what the Supreme Court was going to rule, we had that announcement, ended up coming, I think, about 17 minutes past 10 o'clock from Lord Reid, the President of the Supreme Court. 5 judges making that decision, bearing in mind, of course, that the Court of Appeal decision was only a majority decision, so there was always a possibility it could go either way. But these decisions aren't necessarily as clear-cut as they can sound, and you put on the front, on the strap on the TV saying government's lost this ruling. This wasn't in principle, the government has no right to send people to another country to either be processed for asylum or to actually spend their rest of their lives to be sent there after their asylum claim has been ruled valid. This was a judgment that said, because of these particular failings, substantial grounds for believing asylum seekers were at risk of ill treatment, or this term, refoulement, i.e. forcibly returned to their homeland where they could face persecution. If the government can tackle those issues, if they can get a treaty with the Rwandan government in writing where they will not return people to other countries of origin, where they agree to say, for instance, as it's been suggested, send Home Office staff. I mean, God forbid if the Home Office staff are training you up. I'm not sure that improves things much, but Home Office staff to Rwanda to train up their people to go through similar processes they would face here in the UK. It's just on Rwandan territory. Would that be enough for the government to go back to the Supreme Court and say, aha, you ruled on these grounds it wasn't a safe policy. We've now dealt with that, at which point the Supreme Court would say, that's fine, off you go.
I mean, there is that possibility, and there's also a possibility with having a treaty with Rwanda, which would then have to be voted through in the House of Commons. So you need to be able to get colleagues on side to ensure that that's the correct course of action. But I think the real problem is, and this is what Lord Reid had brought up, in the case of when Israel was putting people into Rwanda, they were sending migrants there. The Rwandan government had agreed to abide by certain conditions and then promptly didn't. So I'm not sure that anybody would be convinced that even if you had it written down, that the Rwandan government would stick by it. They have form for this. So I think that this country is now off the cards.
Benedict?
Well, exactly, because then all that would happen is even if the Supreme Court did rubber stamp it, then we'd go to the European Court of Human Rights and they'd say the exact same thing. So we'd still be in the same bind. I'm going to keep saying it. The government keeps kicking the can down the road, keeps kicking the issue. It is going to require something quite drastic. It is going to require something like leaving the ECHR. It is going to require...
When you say leaving the ECHR, you mean the European Convention on Human Rights?
Yes, that's what I mean. And it is going to require... And this,
or
I'm afraid,
just ignoring the European Court on Human Rights, which is what pretty much every other country does.
Which a lot of countries do. But this is the problem, is that it requires a difficult, tough decision. It also requires, therefore, an alternative. And I suspect most people wouldn't trust this government to come up with a viable alternative. I certainly wouldn't. That would be my sort of major drawback to it, which is, OK, we get rid of that, but who is going to come up with the alternative? And, you know, I'm afraid until this country grasps, and the leadership of this country grasps, that there are no easy outs, that you can't just go, oh, we're abiding by all the rules, but we're outsourcing it, and it all looks lovely because it technically applies. You need to make the difficult decisions. Either you're in favour of lots of people coming in here, or you're in favour of keeping them out. Either way, you need to take it seriously. And this government doesn't do that.
But how about also just looking at the fact that we don't process the claims that we do have? We wouldn't be in such a mess, perhaps, if the Home Office had got its act together and actually dealt with the claims that it had.
You were Special Advisor for about a year or so in the Home Office. You worked for the then Immigration Minister Caroline Noakes. I genuinely can't think of somebody who has few of the same opinions as the just ousted Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. What did you identify as the problem? Why can't the Home Office, I don't know, do its bleeding job?
It was down to staff retention for a lot of the time. If you aren't paying people very much money and putting them through some pretty horrendous cases, now, as much as
it's difficult for them to process these cases.
They are very, very complicated cases, and a lot of times you're waiting for information to come back from countries where record keeping...
What's that got to do with someone's pay?
Great. You are also dealing with cases of torture. You are dealing with cases of women being trafficked, children being trafficked. Yep. There are pretty horrendous stories out there, and I don't think any of us sitting here would like to read through those on a daily basis.
So that's why they're only capable of getting through one a week on average, what they were doing for the last couple of years.
Yeah, and it wasn't enough. We didn't have enough people. We didn't have very well-trained people. We weren't bringing them through the ranks. We weren't having more senior people come along and look at these cases. So there were a lot of failings that we were trying to address until, sadly, such times as we were sacked.
Seems to happen a lot at the Home Office, doesn't it? It really does. What is the solution to all this? Because for a lot of us, there's a practical issue in terms of, I'm sorry, we don't want a load of people without passports, fighting-age men, getting on rickety dinghies, paying people traffickers, organised criminals, to come to this country, to have a pickup service provided by the Navy and the RNLI, and then be put at a huge expense to the public purse. What is it now, 6 billion, 8 billion a year or something, put up in hotels or in barges or wherever they are this week, and staying in this country. We don't want them. The British people have said, we don't want those people. We just don't care. We don't think these are deserving people, and we don't want them here. There's a practical aspect, stopping them coming and getting rid of them once they're here. But there is also a principle, isn't there, Claire, which is really, really, really simple, which is that we should have control of our borders. The 2016 referendum on Brexit, that was about having control of our borders. The vote in 2019, giving that 80 majority to Boris Johnson, was about, you get Brexit done, have control of our borders. Again and again, government after government, Tony Blair onwards, has basically said, it's a free-for-all, come on in, the water's lovely. The British public have had enough.
Absolutely they have, but you raised a really good point there about returning people. If you don't have agreements to do so, then you can't do it. So the government has sat on its hands with working with the 27 member states of the EU that you have to then agree these returns agreements with. But also you've got basket case countries that you are never going to send people back to.
Yeah. Even though the EU did send people back to
Yeah.
to Rwanda, but they were